Welcome to the module on how to build a facade for a fire server. Although this module is technical, in this first part I'm going to give an introduction to a fairly common problem, and then we will take a look at the basic architecture of the solution. In the rest of the module, we'll look at the technical details we need to understand the situation and how each piece of software is structured to meet the objective, which is to have a fire server. Next, we'll look at an example of an application that is working correctly in a health organization and see how a user accesses the front end from a browser, and this, in turn, accesses the back end via a RESTful API. If we keep looking around internally at the architecture of our backend, we see that the RESTful layer communicates with the service layer, and that then communicates with the DAO layer, and finally we reach the database. Layers has a very well-defined function. It has an abstraction, a particular objective. The first is to have an API, in this case proprietary, created by the organization itself. Then there's the service layer, which contains all the business logic, and in the DAO layer, we have the access to the database. This structure allows us to persist our business objects. Then lastly, we have our application with its front end and its back end. There are other applications in our organization that communicate with our back end to exchange information through this RESTful API. Okay, that's one. And here are some more applications in our organization that interact with our backend in the same way. This scenario is the one that the organization developed, and it has been working correctly for several years. But then along comes an external application, an application developed by third parties that wants to access our backend. We're tempted to allow it access via our RESTful API, but this external application has a restriction requiring it to interoperate via a FHIR RESTful API, and that is where our solution begins to encounter problems. So we have a problem here, because we have a whole solution within an organization that is working correctly. We want to somehow integrate this external application, and we want to touch as little code as possible from our backend because it's been working well for several years. So, if we don't have a FHIR RESTful API layer, we can develop one. And that FHIR Facade RESTful API can directly access our service layer just like our RESTful proprietary layer does. Our backend has a business object that is the person object, and that is where a problem arises. Over on the left side here we have our object, and on the right side we have the FHIR patient resource. Both objects represent the same thing, but they're two different objects. So what we need is some kind of conversion between these two patient objects. This is why it's not possible to have a direct connection between the FHIR Facade and the service layer. What we have to do is add one more layer that adapts the calls that are received from the FHIR Facade to the calls to the service layer. And in addition to creating that adaptation, we need to convert, that is, if we're coming from the FHIR layer, we need to convert from the FHIR patient object to the proprietary object and then go into our service layer. And if we have to return a patient object, we create the reverse path. We convert from our patient model to the FHIR patient resource and return the response. So that's how we can have a FHIR Facade using this solution.